Hello everyone, and welcome to my BNB CBS Gossip 24 channel. Eric's answer crushes Brooke not because it is loud or cruel or theatrically delivered, but because it is calm, final, and devastatingly clear, the kind of answer that lands with more force than any shouted accusation ever could, and in that moment everything that Brooke thought she understood about her place in Eric's world, in the Forrester family, and in the moral center of their endlessly tangled history is quietly but completely undone. Because Eric does not argue with her, he does not defend himself, and he does not soften the truth to spare her feelings. Instead, he simply states it, looking at her with a mixture of sorrow and resolve that tells her this decision was not made in haste, and that is what truly changes everything, because Brooke has always believed that if she just explained herself well enough, if she just reminded Eric of her intentions, her loyalty, her years of sacrifice and love, then she could sway him as she has so many times before, but this time. Eric's answer makes it painfully obvious that persuasion is no longer possible, that the door she assumed would always remain cracked open for her has finally been closed, and as his words sink in, Brooke realizes that this is not just about one disagreement or one mistake or even one betrayal, but about a reckoning that has been building for years, a reckoning Eric has clearly been contemplating long before this conversation ever began, and the crushing weight of that realization hits her all at once, because she sees in his eyes that he has tallied the past in a way she never expected him to, that he has replayed the moments she thought were forgiven or forgotten, and that he has come to a conclusion that does not place her at the center of the Forrester legacy the way she always believed she was, and that realization is what truly shakes her. Because Brooke's identity has always been intertwined with being indispensable, with being the woman who ultimately mattered most, and Eric's answer strips that belief away with surgical precision, reducing it to a painful question she is suddenly forced to face: what happens when you are no longer the exception, when love and history are no longer enough to override principle, loyalty, and boundaries? And as Brooke struggles to respond, words failing her in a way they rarely do, Eric continues, not to pile on but to clarify, to make sure there is no misunderstanding, and he explains that this decision is about the future. About what kind of family he wants to leave behind, about what kind of example he wants to set, and that is when Brooke truly understands the scope of what is happening, because this is not just a personal rejection, it is a structural shift in the Forrester universe, a reordering of priorities that places stability, accountability, and legacy above emotional entanglement. And for a woman who has survived decades by navigating those entanglements, by being at the emotional center of every storm, this is nothing short of earth-shattering. And as the silence stretches between them, thick with unspoken history, Brooke feels something unfamiliar creeping in alongside the hurt and disbelief, a fear that this time she may not be able to bounce back, that this time the narrative may continue without revolving around her redemption, and that fear is what makes Eric's answer so crushing, because it signals a turning point not just for their relationship, but for the entire dynamic of the show. One where long-standing patterns are finally disrupted, and the past no longer guarantees a place in the future, and as Brooke leaves that conversation, her confidence visibly shaken, the ripple effects begin almost immediately, because Brooke without Eric's backing is a Brooke exposed, vulnerable to the judgments and agendas of others who have long resented her influence, and characters who once hesitated to challenge her now see an opening, sensing that the ground beneath her feet is no longer solid. And this shift emboldens them, changing alliances and power dynamics in subtle but significant ways, while Eric, for his part, is not celebrating, because his answer, while firm, comes at a cost to him as well, forcing him to accept the pain of disappointing someone he once cared for deeply in order to protect something larger than either of them, and that moral clarity, rare in a world built on secrets and reversals, is what makes this moment so consequential, because it suggests a new era where actions finally have lasting consequences, and Brooke's journey from this point forward becomes uncertain in a way it hasn't been in years, as she is forced to confront who she is without the safety net of unconditional forgiveness, without the assumption that time and tears will fix everything, and that internal struggle, layered over the external fallout of Eric's decision, promises to drive the story into uncharted emotional territory, where Brooke must either evolve in ways she never has before or risk being left behind by a family and a narrative that are clearly moving on, and as viewers absorb the weight of Eric's answer, they are left with the unmistakable sense that a line has been drawn, that the rules have changed, and that the bold and the beautiful landscape has shifted in a way that cannot be easily undone, because when Eric Forrester finally says no, calmly, deliberately, and without regret, it doesn't just crush Brooke in that moment, it dismantles the assumptions that have defined decades of storytelling, opening the door to a future where legacy matters more than history, and where even the most enduring characters are no longer guaranteed their place at the center of everything. And in the aftermath of Eric's answer, the emotional aftershocks continue to spread far beyond that single, crushing exchange, because Brooke does not simply walk away wounded, she walks away destabilized, carrying with her the unsettling awareness that something fundamental has shifted not only in how Eric sees her but in how she may now be seen by everyone else. And that awareness gnaws at her in quiet moments when there is no one left to convince and no argument left to make, because for the first time in a very long time Brooke is forced to sit with the possibility that she may have misread the depth of Eric's patience, mistaking endurance for agreement and forgiveness for approval, and as she replays his words over and over in her mind, she realizes that what made them so devastating was not just what he said, but what he didn't say, the absence of ambiguity, the absence of hope. The absence of that familiar opening she has relied on so many times before to reinsert herself into the narrative as the inevitable constant, and this absence creates a vacuum that begins to pull at her sense of self, because Brooke has always defined herself through connection, through influence, through being the emotional and moral fulcrum around which the Forresters revolved, and now she is staring down the terrifying question of whether that era has ended, whether the family she once shaped has finally grown beyond her reach. And this internal reckoning is mirrored by the reactions of those around her, because news of Eric's decision does not stay contained for long, and as it spreads, it reframes old conversations, old resentments, and old alliances in a new light, prompting characters who once bit their tongues to speak more freely, and those who once deferred to Brooke's judgment to quietly reassess their loyalties, creating an atmosphere charged with anticipation and uncertainty. As if everyone senses that the ground rules have changed and no one is quite sure where they now stand, and in this environment Brooke finds herself increasingly isolated, not through overt rejection but through subtle shifts in tone, body language, and access, the kinds of changes that signal a loss of standing more loudly than any confrontation ever could, and this slow erosion of her influence is perhaps even more painful than Eric's original answer, because it forces her to confront the reality that power, once lost, does not announce its departure, it simply fades, leaving behind an echo of what once was, and yet even as Brooke grapples with this unraveling, the story refuses to frame her solely as a victim, because the brilliance of this turning point lies in its moral complexity, in the way Eric's answer compels everyone, including Brooke herself, to re-evaluate long-held assumptions about accountability, forgiveness, and entitlement, and as Brooke oscillates between anger and introspection, she is forced to confront uncomfortable truths about the patterns she has repeated, the lines she has crossed, and the way she has often relied on emotional currency to bypass consequences, and this confrontation is neither quick nor easy, because self-awareness rarely arrives fully formed, instead creeping in through moments of doubt, flashes of regret, and unexpected silences where once there would have been certainty. And it is in these moments that Brooke begins to understand that Eric's answer was not designed to punish her, but to free both of them from a cycle that had become unsustainable, a realization that does little to ease the pain but does begin to reframe it, transforming it from a personal rejection into a broader reckoning, and this reframing opens the door to new narrative possibilities, because a Brooke who can no longer rely on the familiar tools of persuasion and emotional leverage is a Brooke forced to adapt, to evolve, to find a sense of worth that is not contingent on being chosen or forgiven, and whether she rises to that challenge or resists it becomes one of the most compelling questions moving forward, because Eric's answer has effectively removed the safety net that once guaranteed her relevance, placing her at a crossroads where growth is no longer optional but necessary for survival, and as the Forrester family adjusts to this new reality, Eric himself becomes a quietly transformative figure, not through grand gestures but through consistency, because his decision sets a precedent that reverberates through future conflicts, signaling that the era of endlessly reversible decisions may be coming to an end, and this consistency lends weight to his authority in a way that words alone never could, making him a moral anchor in a world long defined by shifting allegiances and cyclical drama, and this anchoring effect forces others to consider the long-term implications of their choices, knowing now that Eric's patience, while deep, is not infinite, and that realization injects a new tension into every interaction, because suddenly the stakes feel real again, not just emotionally but structurally, and as viewers watch these dynamics unfold, they are drawn into a more grounded, consequential version of the bold and the beautiful universe, one where history informs the present but does not excuse it, and where even iconic characters must reckon with the impact of their actions. And this evolution in storytelling is precisely why Eric's answer feels so monumental, because it does not rely on shock value or melodrama, but on emotional truth, on the quiet devastation of boundaries finally being enforced, and as Brooke continues to navigate the fallout, her journey becomes less about reclaiming what she has lost and more about redefining who she is in its absence, a process that is messy, painful, and deeply human, and whether that process leads her back into the fold in a new, healthier way or propels her toward an entirely different path remains uncertain, but what is clear is that the old rules no longer apply, and that uncertainty is what keeps the narrative alive, because for the first time in a long while, the future feels genuinely unpredictable, not because of some impending secret or twist, but because the characters themselves are being asked to change in ways that cannot be undone with a single apology or revelation, and in that sense, Eric's answer does not just crush Brooke, it liberates the story from its own repetition, clearing space for deeper character exploration, more meaningful consequences, and a version of drama that resonates not through excess, but through restraint, and as the dust continues to settle, one truth becomes impossible to ignore: everything has changed, not with a scream, not with a betrayal, but with a calm, resolute no that finally meant exactly what it said. What makes the aftermath of Eric's answer linger with such intensity is that it refuses to resolve itself neatly, instead unfolding in layers that expose how deeply entrenched the old dynamics were and how destabilizing their sudden absence can be, especially for someone like Brooke, who has spent a lifetime navigating chaos by positioning herself as indispensable. And as days pass and the initial shock dulls into something heavier and more permanent, she begins to notice how often she reaches for instincts that no longer serve her, how she starts conversations expecting resistance that can be worn down, only to be met with polite finality, and this repeated friction between who she has been and who she is now allowed to be creates a quiet but relentless internal conflict, because Brooke has never lacked passion or conviction, but she has often conflated intensity with righteousness, believing that wanting something badly enough made it morally defensible, and Eric's answer, by refusing to engage on those terms, forces her to confront the uncomfortable possibility that conviction without accountability is simply entitlement dressed up as emotion, and this realization does not arrive as a clean epiphany but as a series of small humiliations and pauses, moments when she realizes she is being heard but not indulged, acknowledged but not accommodated, and this shift fundamentally alters her interactions with everyone around her, because the deference she once commanded is gone, replaced by a cautious distance that feels worse than outright hostility, and as Brooke grapples with this erosion of her influence, she also begins to see how much of her identity was built on the assumption that she would always be forgiven, always be central, always be chosen, and the stripping away of that assumption leaves her raw and defensive, oscillating between anger at Eric for giving up on her and a growing, painful awareness that perhaps he is not the one who changed, but the one who finally stopped enabling a pattern that had long outlived its justification, and this awareness is mirrored in the reactions of others who, emboldened by Eric's resolve, begin to assert boundaries of their own, creating a ripple effect that transforms the emotional ecosystem of the family, because once one boundary holds, others suddenly feel possible, and this collective shift places Brooke in an unfamiliar position where her usual tactics no longer yield results, forcing her to either escalate or retreat, and for the first time, escalation only deepens her isolation, revealing the limits of emotional force in a world that has quietly decided to move on, and yet even as this transformation unfolds, the narrative does not deny Brooke her humanity, because beneath the defensiveness and wounded pride lies a genuine grief for a version of herself that was sustained by constant validation, and letting go of that version feels like a kind of death, a mourning for the woman who believed she could survive anything as long as she was loved enough. And this grief complicates her anger, making it less sharp but more enduring, because it is no longer directed solely outward but inward as well, and as Brooke wrestles with this internal reckoning, Eric's role becomes increasingly symbolic, representing not just a patriarch asserting authority, but a moral line in the sand that challenges the entire community to reconsider what love looks like when it is no longer synonymous with forgiveness without limits. And this challenge resonates deeply because it speaks to a broader truth about relationships, one that the show has often flirted with but rarely committed to, that love can exist alongside boundaries, that care does not require self-erasure, and that sometimes the most loving act is to say no and mean it. And this thematic shift elevates Eric's answer beyond personal conflict, positioning it as a philosophical turning point that reframes decades of storytelling, because it suggests that the cycles of betrayal and reconciliation that once defined the narrative are not inevitable, but chosen, and that choosing differently comes at a cost that must be paid up front rather than deferred indefinitely. And as the characters adjust to this new moral framework, the tension shifts from who will betray whom next to who will actually grow, who will accept responsibility without demanding absolution, and who will cling to old patterns even as they collapse. And Brooke's struggle becomes the most visible embodiment of this tension, because her journey is not about villainy or victimhood, but about the slow, painful dismantling of a survival strategy that no longer works, and whether she can rebuild something more honest in its place remains an open question, one that keeps viewers invested precisely because it resists easy answers. And as weeks turn into months, the long-term implications of Eric's decision become increasingly clear. Because his consistency creates a new baseline for behavior, one that quietly influences how conflicts are approached and resolved, reducing the reliance on dramatic reversals and increasing the weight of deliberate choice. And this recalibration of stakes does not make the world less dramatic, but more resonant, because when reconciliation does occur, it feels earned rather than inevitable, and when separation persists, it feels meaningful rather than temporary. And in this environment, Brooke's potential redemption, if it comes at all, must be grounded in genuine change rather than emotional appeal, requiring her to confront not just what she did, but why she did it, and what she is willing to do differently moving forward. And this requirement challenges her in ways she has long avoided, because introspection has never been her default mode, and the absence of immediate forgiveness forces her to sit with discomfort rather than outrun it, and this stillness becomes the crucible in which her future is forged. Because growth, unlike drama, cannot be rushed or performed, it must be lived. And as the audience watches Brooke navigate this unfamiliar terrain, they are invited to reconsider their own relationship with the character, to see her not as an untouchable icon or perpetual lightning rod, but as a deeply flawed human being grappling with the consequences of choices that once seemed inconsequential. And this reframing deepens the emotional impact of Eric's answer retroactively, because it becomes clear that its power lies not in what it takes away from Brooke, but in what it demands of her. And as the narrative continues to unfold, the lingering question is no longer whether Brooke can reclaim her former position, but whether she can redefine success on terms that do not require dominance or absolution. And that question, heavy and unresolved, is what truly changes everything, because it signals a future where transformation is possible but not guaranteed, where legacy is shaped not by passion alone but by integrity, and where even the most enduring characters must confront the truth that love, when it is real, does not always say yes. And in that truth lies both the devastation of Eric's answer and its quiet, enduring power.